Ever since Mirabelle was little, folks assumed she was just painfully shy. She didn't speak much, and when she did, her words came out soft and careful, like she was worried about stepping on invisible toes. Her teachers would comment on how quiet she was, always buried in a book or gazing out the window, lost in her own world. Kids around her mistook her calm nature for awkwardness, and even adults sometimes talked to her as if she couldn't understand them. But Mirabelle was far from clueless. She just liked to soak up her surroundings in silence. She felt comfortable observing rather than jumping into the action. She was the type of kid who watched a butterfly flutter by and wondered what it was like to fly, instead of trying to catch it. Her mother, on the other hand, thought Mirabelle was too delicate for her own good, urging her to be more sociable or take a chance now and then. Mirabelle tried to explain that she preferred the quiet, but her mom only shook her head in frustration. Her younger sister, Chloe, was the polar opposite, charming, outgoing, always the life of the party. Chloe loved teasing Mirabelle about staying cooped up in her room instead of hanging with her and her friends. Despite their obvious differences, Mirabelle cared for Chloe. She admired her sister's boldness, but something held her back from fully stepping out of her comfort zone. Over the years, Mirabelle's natural reserve turned into a bit of a cloak she wore every day. She figured it was easier to let people assume she was shy than to explain that she simply didn't need the spotlight. Yet this quiet approach came at a cost. Most folks never bothered to see beyond her silence. She felt a deep longing to connect but was never quite sure how to begin. Growing up, Mirabelle noticed that her house wasn't as warm and fuzzy as other homes. Her mother was always juggling tasks, fussing about her job, and managing household chores in a whirlwind of stress. Chloe was busy with her dance lessons, cheerleading practice, and endless stream of friends. Meanwhile, Mirabelle found it comforting to keep to herself. She wasn't the type to pop into the kitchen and chit-chat while dinner was cooking or hang out in the living room during movie night. She'd rather slip away to her room, curl up with a favorite book, or put on her headphones and lose herself in a song. That self-chosen solitude created a gap between her and the rest of the family. Her mother started referring to her as antisocial, and Chloe would roll her eyes whenever Mirabelle disappeared upstairs. It wasn't that Mirabelle hated them or anything, she just felt more at ease in her own space. She'd watch the chaos from a distance, thinking it was better to stay in her little bubble than risk being misunderstood or overshadowed. But over time, her absence became more noticeable. Family gatherings, birthday parties, and holiday dinners would come and go. Mirabelle showed up out of obligation but stayed on the outskirts, barely making conversation before slipping away again. Her mother, feeling the distance, began to treat her like an odd stranger, someone she couldn't quite figure out. Chloe, with her big personality, often hogged all the attention, leaving Mirabelle to fade into the background. Mirabelle felt guilty about that distance. She wanted to be closer, but it always felt so uncomfortable to speak up. It was like there was this invisible barrier she'd built around herself, and she wasn't sure how to break it down without losing the small corner of the world she found safe. One Friday night, Chloe bounced into Mirabelle's room with an invitation as sparkly as her personality. She wanted Mirabelle to come along to a new club opening downtown. The kind of place with loud music, neon lights, and a crowd ready to dance until dawn. Chloe's eyes were practically glowing with excitement, and for a moment, Mirabelle felt a twinge of curiosity. Part of her wondered what it'd be like to let loose on a dance floor, to forget for a few hours that she was the quiet one. But the louder part of her remembered how overwhelming big gatherings could be. The thought of weaving through crowds, the pounding bass vibrating through her chest, and the strangers pressing in from all sides made her heart pound for all the wrong reasons. She hesitated. Chloe mistook that silence for reluctance, so she tried tempting Mirabelle with all the usual promises. New friends, good times, maybe even cute guys who'd show some interest. But Mirabelle just couldn't bring herself to say yes. So she finally declined, but she did it softly, hoping Chloe wouldn't be too upset. Of course, Chloe took it as a personal rejection. She flung her hands in the air and said something about how Mirabelle always played it safe and boring, never wanting to experience life. Mirabelle's cheeks burned, but all she could do was shrug, feeling her words stick in her throat like glue. Chloe stormed out, leaving Mirabelle with a pit in her stomach. She wanted to reach out, to apologize, to explain that it was just too much for her that night. But she couldn't. Her fear of letting someone else see her anxiety kept her tongue-tied. Little did she know that this one simple no would spark misunderstandings that wouldn't be cleared easily. Tension filled the next family dinner like an unseen storm cloud. Everyone gathered around the table, but the usual chatter felt forced. Chloe was especially quiet at first, pushing her food around on her plate. Mirabelle tried to keep her head down, hoping to fly under the radar. But something in Chloe's eyes suggested she was on the verge of speaking her mind, no matter how harsh it might sound. When their mother asked Chloe how her night at the club went, Chloe launched into a dramatic retelling. Her words were bright and boisterous, but it was clear she was trying to highlight everything Mirabelle had missed. Then, all of a sudden, her attention snapped to Mirabelle. The next words Chloe spoke felt like shards of glass. She said Mirabelle might as well have been invisible for all the effort she put into being part of the family. She insisted she was tired of dragging around a sister who acted like a ghost at home. Mirabelle sat there, her face heating up, chest tight. She glanced around for support but found only uncomfortable looks and awkward coughs. Her mother didn't say much, just shook her head with a disappointed sigh. Chloe carried on, saying she was embarrassed to even call Mirabelle her sister sometimes. The words left a deep cut in Mirabelle's heart. In that painful moment, Mirabelle felt more than just embarrassment. She felt shame, confusion, and a loneliness she couldn't put into words. She swallowed hard, blinking back tears. She didn't know how to fight back, nor did she want to. The hateful remarks stung, but they also confirmed her worst fears. She was different, and that difference had pushed her so far from her sister that she couldn't see a way back. While Mirabelle struggled to navigate her rocky relationship with her mom and sister, she found a gentle haven in her father's presence. He was a calm soul with a warm smile that could melt even her biggest worries. Whenever he noticed the tension brewing or saw Mirabelle's eyes brim with unshed tears, he'd quietly pull her aside. In the middle of the night, when everyone else was asleep, he would knock gently on her door, carrying a glass of warm milk or a small snack, and invite her for a late-night chat in the living room. Mirabelle would sit next to him on the couch, knees tucked under her chin, and just listen to his comforting voice. He didn't push her to change or scold her for being shy. Instead, he'd tell her stories from his own childhood, how he, too, had once felt overshadowed by more outgoing siblings. His words were gentle reminders that there was nothing wrong with valuing peace and quiet, and that sometimes the biggest hearts belong to the quietest people. One night, after the tense dinner, her father noticed she looked especially down. He came in, sat beside her, and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. He said, "Belle, you've got a heart that sees what others miss. Don't let anyone make you feel small for that." His eyes were filled with understanding, and in that moment, Mirabelle felt tears slip down her cheeks, not from sadness alone, but from relief. At least someone believed in her value. He also reminded her that having a reserved nature didn't mean she was doomed to be lonely. "You'll find your place," he promised, gently squeezing her hand. Little did Mirabelle know, the promise of finding her place was about to take shape sooner than she ever imagined. A few weeks later, her father sat her down at the kitchen table, looking more serious than usual. He cleared his throat and fiddled with a folded piece of paper in his hands before finally meeting her gaze. "Belle," he began, using the nickname that only he seemed to remember. "I've been thinking about your future." She immediately braced herself, expecting another lecture about going out more or trying to make new friends. Instead, he smiled gently and explained that he wanted her to join his company. It wasn't the biggest corporation around, but it was large enough to have significant influence in their city. Mirabelle's jaw dropped. The very idea of her in a bustling office environment made her heart flutter with panic. She imagined countless meetings, presentations, and coworkers constantly interacting. That alone was enough to make her stomach churn. Sensing her hesitation, he added a twist. He only wanted her to work in a role that wouldn't draw too much attention. Maybe an administrative position or a support role, something that let her operate behind the scenes. "I know you hate the spotlight," he said, "but I also know you're capable of a whole lot more than you think. Trust me on this." Mirabelle hesitated, chewing on her bottom lip. Could she handle an office job without completely freezing up? Her father's eyes shone with quiet determination, telling her that he believed she could. So, after taking a deep breath, she agreed. She reasoned that if it was behind the scenes, maybe it wouldn't be so bad. She'd earn some income, gain a bit of experience, and most of all, make her dad proud. Little did she know that the small yes would lead her down a path that would flip her entire life upside down. When Mirabelle first walked into her father's company, she felt like an imposter. Wearing a crisp blouse and slacks that felt a bit too stuffy, she clutched her bag and stepped through the revolving doors. The lobby was bustling, phones ringing, people tapping away on laptops, voices echoing across the marble floors. Everyone looked so confident, and there she was, the quiet soul with zero corporate experience. Her father had arranged for her to start as a secretary's assistant. She'd mostly handle filing, scheduling, and other routine tasks. And to protect her privacy and ward off any special treatment, he asked that nobody know she was his daughter. Mirabelle agreed, thinking it might help her blend in and observe from the sidelines. Still, the magnitude of her new environment rattled her nerves. Despite her anxious thoughts, she tried her best to appear calm. She greeted people softly, nodding politely when she was introduced to various team members. Each time she met someone new, she felt a jolt of anxiety flare up, but she did her best to smile and keep her voice steady. It was exhausting, though. By lunchtime on her first day, she locked herself in the restroom for a few minutes just to breathe and collect herself. In her mind, she couldn't stop second-guessing. Do they think I'm weird? Am I messing this up already? But she also felt a tiny spark of pride that she'd even managed to show up. She was there, in the thick of the hustle and bustle, making a brave attempt. This was a new chapter, and she was determined, despite her fears, to see it through. She just didn't realize how many hurdles and surprises were waiting around the corner. Mirabelle soon noticed that some of her coworkers weren't exactly rolling out the welcome mat. Her quiet demeanor was quickly pegged as standoffish. Small groups formed around the coffee machine, whispering under their breath or casting quick glances her way when they thought she wasn't looking. She overheard a couple of them asking why she never joined their lunch gatherings or after-work drinks. One woman shrugged and said, "She seems stuck up," while another suggested she simply couldn't handle social situations. It stung, but Mirabelle was used to misunderstandings. Instead of confronting them, she just tried to keep her head down. She focused on her tasks, organizing files, proofreading documents, handling appointments. But the more she kept to herself, the more distant others became. It was a vicious cycle. They thought she was aloof, which only pushed her further into her shell, leaving them with more reason to think she was uninterested. Her immediate supervisor was a stern woman named Ms. Dawson, who seemed to have no patience for shy types. Whenever Mirabelle handed her some work, Ms. Dawson would barely nod, never offering praise or encouragement. It made Mirabelle want to shrink even more. Despite her father's confidence, she found herself wondering if she'd made the wrong decision. Was this place too big, too harsh for someone like her? Late one afternoon, Mirabelle overheard two coworkers chatting near her desk. "You think she's got some sort of secret?" one asked, half joking. "Maybe she's a spy or something," the other replied. They laughed, but to Mirabelle, it confirmed how out of place she seemed. She swallowed the lump in her throat and reminded herself this was temporary. She had to stay strong. For her father's sake, she'd keep trying, even though every cold shoulder felt like a slap in the face. Just when Mirabelle thought the entire office was set against her, a glimmer of kindness appeared in the form of Desmond. He was the new guy stationed a few desks away and had a knack for flashing a friendly grin at everyone he passed. His tall frame and naturally confident stride turned a lot of heads, and Mirabelle noticed that several of her female coworkers seemed especially eager to chat him up. Yet, despite all the attention, Desmond didn't act stuck-up or arrogant. He was surprisingly down to earth. One day, while Mirabelle was wrestling with a jammed copier, Desmond stepped in to help. She expected a typical moment, someone breezing by with a polite, "Need help?" But Desmond lingered, making sure the machine was fully functional before he walked away. He even gave her a quick tutorial on how to unjam the paper in a simpler way. They didn't talk much beyond a "thank you" and "you're welcome," but his easygoing smile made her feel less invisible. Over the next couple of weeks, Desmond made a point to say hi whenever he saw her. Sometimes it was just a nod or a light-hearted comment about the weather, but the fact that he acknowledged her in a friendly way stood out like a beacon in that rather chilly office environment. Mirabelle felt her nerves ease a bit whenever he was around, though she couldn't quite say why. Maybe it was just nice to know not everyone saw her as the weird, antisocial girl. She even managed to ask him how his day was going once, surprising herself by initiating the conversation. He responded with genuine warmth, telling her a funny story about his struggle with the office coffee machine. Little by little, she felt a faint spark of connection, one that gave her hope that she wasn't entirely alone in this new world. As the weeks rolled on, Mirabelle realized that she and Desmond had formed a sort of gentle routine. Most mornings, they'd pass each other in the hallway or near the break room, and Desmond would offer a quick, friendly remark, something simple like, "Hope your day's off to a good start," or "Don't let Ms. Dawson scare you too much today." His tone was always light, almost playful, making Mirabelle grin in spite of herself. She felt silly for how much those small greetings brightened her mood, but she also recognized how rare genuine kindness was in her life. Every now and then they'd have a brief conversation, usually about work tasks or the sometimes comical challenges of office life. Their chats were never too long. Mirabelle's anxiety made sure of that, but each interaction was a tiny reprieve from the tense environment around her. In those fleeting moments, she found herself relaxing a bit, realizing she could talk to another person without feeling judged or misunderstood. At times, she caught Desmond giving her a thoughtful look. She couldn't decipher it fully, but it wasn't a pity, nor was it the cold dismissal she'd grown used to. It was as if he was genuinely curious about her. That kind of open curiosity both intrigued and unnerved her. She wasn't sure if she should keep letting her guard down or double up her defenses. But something about Desmond's easy presence made her want to trust him, at least a little. She still didn't share much about herself, and he didn't pry. But the way he listened when she spoke, the way he nodded and gave sincere replies, made her believe there was a possibility of true friendship or maybe something more in the future. It was a glimmer of hope in a life that had felt mostly gray. Mirabelle had no clue that the easygoing Desmond she exchanged small talk with held a massive secret. As chance would have it, she overheard a peculiar phone call one late afternoon. She was staying behind to organize some files, and the office was mostly empty. Desmond, not realizing she was still around, was speaking in hushed tones on his cell phone in a nearby corridor. She couldn't make out every word, but a few phrases stood out. "I need to maintain my cover, and Father wants me to understand the business from the ground up." Her curiosity piqued. Mirabelle approached, but then thought better of it. She didn't want to invade his privacy. Still, her mind whirled. Cover, she thought. Father wants him to learn the business? Something about the conversation hinted that Desmond wasn't just an ordinary employee. But she wasn't the type to jump to conclusions without more proof. A few days later, gossip floated through the office like a strong wind. A couple of deskmates were whispering about a big-shot billionaire family rumored to have a son working incognito in various companies to gain real-world experience. The story sounded like something straight out of a movie, but the details kept matching up with Desmond's habits and the phone call she overheard. Mirabelle pieced things together, though she wasn't entirely sure. Desmond was far too approachable and unassuming for a billionaire heir. But the more she observed him, the more she noticed subtle clues: expensive cufflinks, the high-end phone he tried to hide, the casual mention of attending exclusive events a while back. Suddenly, the friendly coworker who seemed so eager to help her came into a different light. She couldn't figure out why someone with so much power and wealth would work under such a facade. But a new sense of intrigue filled her, mixing with her growing admiration for his kindness. As Mirabelle grew closer to Desmond through small, friendly interactions, others in the office began to notice. Some cast suspicious glances every time the two of them had a quiet chat by the copier or shared a laugh over a spreadsheet mishap. Many employees, especially those smitten with Desmond's charm, felt annoyed that the supposedly aloof secretary's assistant was getting his attention. The whispers started small but escalated quickly. "Wah." Mirabelle tried to ignore the rumors, but it was hard not to feel their weight. She'd never been the subject of workplace gossip before. In fact, she'd mostly slipped by unnoticed. Now, she wasn't just an invisible presence, she was a target. The tension among her coworkers thickened, and she sensed their glares as she walked past. A couple of them outright excluded her from group tasks, choosing to leave her off email chains or forgetting to invite her to important meetings. Desmond, on the other hand, seemed almost oblivious to the toxic undercurrent. Or maybe he was aware and just chose not to acknowledge it. He continued to be friendly, sometimes even going out of his way to see if she needed help with a heavy workload. When they spoke, his voice was calm and reassuring, like he truly cared about how she was doing. But Mirabelle's anxiety was climbing to an all-time high. The more the office buzzed with speculation, the more she worried that Desmond would catch wind of it and decide she wasn't worth the trouble. She braced herself for the moment he might drift away to preserve his own reputation. To her surprise, though, he stuck around, as if determined to prove that genuine kindness could outweigh office gossip. Day by day, the pressure at work built into a stifling atmosphere. With the rumor mill running at full tilt, Mirabelle found it harder to concentrate on her tasks. She noticed more snide comments from people she barely even knew, remarks about her clinging to Desmond or trying to play the damsel in distress. Those words hit her like tiny daggers, reinforcing her old fears about not fitting in. At times, she caught Desmond shooting puzzled glances in the direction of hushed whispers. But whenever he asked if something was wrong, Mirabelle brushed it off with a polite smile and a non-committal shrug. She didn't want to cause trouble or make him feel obligated to defend her. Part of her wanted to speak up, but the rest of her believed it was safer to say nothing. She also realized that Ms. Dawson was growing increasingly critical. Suddenly, small mistakes, like forgetting to note the extension code on a phone message, became grounds for mini-lectures. Ms. Dawson even hinted that Mirabelle might be distracted by personal matters, which only deepened Mirabelle's discomfort. She knew she had no solid evidence to prove Ms. Dawson was influenced by the swirling rumors, but the timing was too coincidental to ignore. Between the gossip, the disapproving stares, and the mountain of work, Mirabelle felt like she was drifting in a hostile sea. She clung to any moment of peace, often retreating to quiet corners of the building, like the stairwell or the seldom-used break room on the second floor, just so she could breathe without feeling like eyes were on her. And even though Desmond's kindness was a shining light, she feared it might flicker out if things got too tense. She was stuck in the shadows, torn between staying invisible and risking more attention just for a shred of camaraderie. One evening, after most of the staff had gone home, Mirabelle stayed behind to finish some overdue paperwork. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights was oddly soothing. No gossip, no stares, just the soft rustle of papers. She was so focused that she nearly jumped out of her skin when Desmond suddenly appeared with 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand. "Figured you could use a pick-me-up," he said with a friendly grin. He set 1 cup on her desk and the rich, aromatic steam curled in the air. She thanked him softly, feeling an unexpected warmth rise to her cheeks. They ended up chatting about mundane things, the day's workload, the painfully slow office computers, even their shared dislike for the vending machine's stale snacks. But beneath the surface, there was a comforting intimacy in that simple conversation. Mirabelle felt like she could finally exhale. At one point, Desmond leaned back and gazed at her thoughtfully. "You know," he said, his voice gentle, "I wish people would see how capable you really are." He spoke as though he'd noticed all the rumors and tension but chose not to dwell on them. "I've watched you work. You're detail-oriented and you don't complain. That's rare around here," he added with a playful smirk. Mirabelle's heart fluttered. She wanted to respond, to share how much his kindness meant, but words didn't come easily. Instead, she managed a shy smile and told him she appreciated the vote of confidence. They sipped their coffees in a companionable silence, letting the quiet of the empty office wrap around them like a soft blanket. That night, she went home feeling lighter. In that brief exchange, Desmond had given her something she desperately needed, a reminder that someone, somewhere, valued her for who she was, not who she wasn't. Despite that comforting moment with Desmond, Mirabelle couldn't ignore the weight pressing down on her. At home, she felt more distant than ever from her mother and Chloe. Dinner conversations were practically non-existent. Chloe was busy flaunting her social life, talking about her nights out and all the events she was invited to, clearly hoping Mirabelle would feel a pang of jealousy. Their mother, exhausted from her own routines, barely bothered to ask Mirabelle about her day anymore. Every harsh word at the office, every rumor, and every cold shoulder triggered the memory of Chloe's biting comments about her being invisible. It was like those childhood insecurities were on replay in her head, constantly reminding her of how she never seemed to measure up. Even when she found a small pocket of joy, like chatting with Desmond, doubt soon followed, whispering that it wouldn't last or that it was all a misunderstanding. She also felt torn because she hadn't told her father about the negativity at work. He'd been so proud of her for stepping into the corporate world, and she didn't want to disappoint him by admitting she was struggling. Her father was her rock, the only one who ever made her feel completely safe. The last thing she wanted was to add stress to his life, especially since he was showing signs of fatigue lately. She saw him yawn more frequently, skip meals, and rub his temples when he thought no one was looking. So Mirabelle tried to bear it all alone, the isolation at home, the misunderstandings at work, the swirling rumors about her budding friendship with Desmond. She felt like she was tiptoeing on a tightrope, balancing everyone's expectations while keeping her real worries hidden. She didn't realize how close she was to a tipping point or how drastically her life was about to change. One weekend, Mirabelle's world flipped upside down. It started with a phone call late Friday night. Her father had collapsed at work and an ambulance rushed him to the hospital. Panicked, Mirabelle, her mother, and Chloe raced to the emergency room where they found him hooked up to monitors and looking pale as a ghost. The doctor said he'd suffered a severe strain on his heart, likely from stress and overwork. Mirabelle felt her heart sink. How had she missed the signs? Sitting by his bedside, she listened with bated breath as the doctor explained that he needed immediate rest and possibly surgery if his condition didn't stabilize. In that sterile, white hospital room, everything felt surreal. Her father, her strongest supporter, her guiding light, looked frail and vulnerable. It shattered her heart to see him like that, struggling to breathe, eyes fluttering with exhaustion. Chloe and their mother hovered in the background, both looking worried but somewhat detached. Chloe tried to crack nervous jokes, a habit she had when she was uncomfortable, while their mom peppered the doctor with questions about medications and hospital bills. Mirabelle, on the other hand, just held her father's hand and tried not to cry. She wanted to be brave for him, to show him that she could handle herself, but she felt like a lost child again. That night, she barely slept, haunted by the memory of her father's labored breathing and the constant beep of hospital machines. She realized how much she depended on him for emotional support, and the thought of losing him made her chest tighten painfully. She prayed in her own quiet way, hoping, wishing, begging for his recovery. If there was ever a moment Mirabelle felt the weight of responsibility, it was then, with her father's life hanging in the balance. A couple of days into her father's hospital stay, he managed to gather enough strength to speak clearly for a short while. Mirabelle was perched on a plastic chair by his bedside, her eyes glued to the drips and monitors that seemed to be the only thing keeping him stable. Then she heard his voice, soft but urgent. "Belle," he rasped, using her childhood nickname again, and she quickly leaned in to listen. With effort, he explained that the company needed someone trustworthy at the helm, especially since the board was already rumbling about possible leadership changes. He'd built the company from the ground up and cared for it like a second family. He couldn't stand the thought of it falling into the hands of people who'd run it purely for profit. His voice trembled as he pleaded with her to step in, just temporarily, until he recovered. Mirabelle felt her stomach twist. Become the acting CEO? She could hardly lead a small meeting without breaking into a cold sweat. How could she possibly manage an entire corporation? She glanced at the chart showing his lab results and the worried lines on his face. He was desperate, and she was the only one he trusted enough for the job. Even in his weak state, he placed a trembling hand over hers, giving it a squeeze that spoke volumes. "I believe in you," he whispered, coughing weakly afterward. Mirabelle's eyes stung with tears. She wanted to protest, to tell him there must be someone else, maybe a board member or an experienced executive, but the look in his eyes reminded her of all the times he'd been there for her. This wasn't just about business, it was about preserving a dream he'd nurtured for years. Her breath caught in her throat, and after a few seconds of agonizing silence, she nodded, giving him her word that she'd do her best. In the days that followed, Mirabelle's head spun with what-ifs and I can'ts. She spent hours alone in the hospital's quiet corridors, torn between honoring her father's request and the paralyzing fear of stepping into such a public role. Her entire life, she'd avoided the spotlight. Now she was being pushed front and center in a high-stakes position where everyone's eyes would be on her. When she wasn't at the hospital, she was bombarded with calls from board members and executives who wanted to know the plan. Some were polite, simply concerned about her father's condition. Others were more demanding, clearly skeptical that a young, introverted secretary's assistant could manage the company. The more she heard their doubts, the tighter her chest felt. Yet part of her bristled at their condescending tone. She wasn't a clueless child, she'd seen enough to understand how things worked. Maybe not everything, but enough to know you don't let a company crumble under pressure. Late at night, she found herself pacing the living room, going over annual reports and performance charts that her father had stored at home. They were complicated, filled with graphs and business jargon that made her eyes glaze over. But she kept reading, her father's weak, hopeful smile etched in her mind. She knew this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about saving what her father had worked so hard to build, and maybe saving him, too, by letting him rest without worrying. The real challenge was summoning the courage to face a boardroom full of seasoned professionals and lead them, even if only temporarily. The idea made her stomach churn. But every time she felt like giving up, she reminded herself of the promise she'd made by her father's bedside. Keeping the promise was the only thing stronger than her fear. After many sleepless nights, Mirabelle reached her breaking point in the best possible way. She was tired of feeling helpless, tired of feeling overshadowed, and most of all, tired of letting her father's legacy hang in the balance. So she took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and decided to take the leap. Before she could lose her nerve, she called an urgent meeting with the board. Her voice trembled as she introduced herself, explaining that she'd be fulfilling her father's wishes by stepping in as acting CEO. She expected immediate laughter or resistance. Some of the board members did look doubtful, exchanging raised eyebrows or skeptical glances. One of them even cleared his throat as if he was about to object, but then paused, apparently taken aback by the sheer determination in her eyes. And so began a whirlwind of phone calls, document signings, and quick lessons in management. Mirabelle felt like she was trying to drink from a fire hose, so much information was thrown at her all at once. But a small part of her realized she'd been observing the corporate world every day at the office, even if from the sidelines. She knew who the genuine workers were and who skated by with minimal effort. She understood which projects thrived on good teamwork and which ones got bogged down in endless bureaucracy. Although she was petrified inside, she found a surprising surge of energy each time she checked off a new task. She'd email a directive, sign a contract, or delegate a responsibility and think, I can do this. Yes, she was still anxious, but there was no turning back now. She'd promised her father she would stand in for him, and she wasn't about to let him down. On a crisp Monday morning, Mirabelle took another monumental step, one that would permanently change how the entire company viewed her. She held a formal board meeting where she officially introduced herself as the temporary CEO. Dressed in a simple yet professional outfit, she tried to calm her racing heart as she stood at the head of the massive conference table. The room was filled with senior executives, board members, and department heads, many of whom she recognized from her days as a secretary's assistant. But this time, all eyes were locked on her. She greeted them with a small nod and began her address. Her voice shook at first, but the more she spoke, the steadier it became. She explained her father's condition, affirming she was stepping in to uphold his vision until he recovered. She felt the weight of skepticism hanging in the air. Some people openly questioned her capability while others whispered among themselves, probably recalling how quiet she'd been around the office. Still, she pressed on. At one point, she paused and looked each person in the eye. She acknowledged her lack of experience but insisted she understood the company's heartbeat better than they realized. She knew the employees' strengths, the office politics, even which departments clashed the most. Maybe she hadn't been in the spotlight, but she'd been paying attention from behind the scenes all this time. There was a collective murmur of surprise. She saw some eyebrows lift as if they'd underestimated her more than they cared to admit. Once the meeting ended, a hush settled over the room. The shift was almost tangible. The woman who'd been nearly invisible yesterday was now at the helm of the entire operation. Whether they liked it or not, Mirabelle had arrived, quiet, determined, and ready to take the company forward. The aftermath of that board meeting was like dropping a stone into a still pond. The ripples spread far and wide. By lunchtime, nearly everyone in the company knew that the introverted secretary's assistant was now the interim CEO. Reactions ranged from stunned disbelief to outright annoyance. Some employees shrugged and continued their work, seeing it as just another twist in the corporate story. Others whispered about nepotism, wondering if she was only there because of her father. And a few openly rolled their eyes, predicting she'd crumble under the pressure. The gossip circulated rapidly. People brought it up in the break room, the elevator, even via whispered phone conversations at their desks. Mirabelle tried to block out the chatter. She had too many real challenges on her plate, like reviewing budgets, making decisions on pending contracts, and meeting with department heads who were eager to test her mettle. Yet, even as she was drowning in work, she couldn't completely ignore the sting of those hushed voices. She also noticed that Desmond had grown uncharacteristically quiet. She'd see him in the hallway or across the boardroom and he'd offer a friendly smile or a slight nod, but there was a tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. Maybe he was trying to adjust to the fact that his friend and ally was now his boss, at least in name. Or perhaps he had other worries. Mirabelle couldn't tell, and she didn't have the emotional bandwidth to explore it. All she knew was that she missed his lighthearted conversations. Despite the swirling opinions and heightened scrutiny, Mirabelle dug in. She started working longer hours, determined to understand each department's challenges so she could make informed decisions. The initial days were rough, but something within her, maybe her father's faith, maybe her own buried resilience, pushed her forward one step at a time. While Mirabelle wrestled with the new pressures at the office, her home life took a turbulent turn. One evening, she came home exhausted, only to find her mother and Chloe waiting for her in the living room. Their expressions were a mix of confusion and frustration, and Mirabelle braced herself for a tough conversation. Her mother, arms folded across her chest, asked, "So you're actually CEO now? Why didn't you tell us before making a big announcement?" Chloe chimed in, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Guess you like stealing the spotlight after all, huh?" The mocking question stung, but Mirabelle reminded herself to stay composed. She tried to explain how their father needed someone he trusted at the helm. She told them it was his request, that she didn't seek out this role for attention or glory. Chloe's eyes narrowed as she retorted, "Dad trusts you with the whole company, but you can't even hang out with me at a club or join a family gathering without disappearing?" Old resentments flared up and Mirabelle felt her temper rise, a rare feeling for her. In that charged moment, long-buried hurt spilled into the open. Chloe accused Mirabelle of being selfish, always ignoring the family's needs. Their mother quietly echoed that sentiment, saying she never understood why Mirabelle couldn't just try harder to fit in. Each word cut deeper, revealing the years of misunderstanding and judgment that had shaped their relationship. Mirabelle stood there, caught in a wave of conflicting emotions. She wanted to shout that she wasn't invisible by choice, that she was just different. But shouting wasn't her style. Instead, her voice came out trembling. She said she was sorry if her nature had caused them pain, but she also needed them to realize she was doing this for their father's sake, not for any personal glory. The confrontation ended in uneasy silence, leaving everyone lost in their own thoughts. Despite the tense showdown, Mirabelle knew she couldn't just let things fester. The very next day, she made a deliberate effort to talk to her mother and Chloe separately, hoping to clear the air. It was awkward, especially since none of them were used to deep, emotional discussions. But Mirabelle started by saying she recognized how her aloofness had hurt T. of being judged or overshadowed. Her mother, though hesitant, listened carefully. Chloe, arms crossed, seemed less open at first, but after some honest words from Mirabelle, her expression softened just a fraction. Mirabelle finally confessed how those spiteful comments about her being invisible had cut her to the core. She explained that every mocking jibe made her retreat deeper, which only fueled more misunderstanding. Quietly, their mother admitted she'd been worried about Mirabelle for a long time, but she didn't know how to connect with a child so different from Chloe. Chloe, in turn, said she'd always felt overshadowed by her mother's concern, and teasing Mirabelle became a twisted way to deal with that. The conversation was raw and uncomfortable. There were tears, frustrated sighs, and moments where nobody knew what to say. But slowly, as words spilled out, Mirabelle sensed something shifting. The tension, like a thick fog, began to lift. She felt an indescribable relief as they all acknowledged their faults. In that moment, Mirabelle understood that forgiveness wasn't about excusing hurtful actions, it was about choosing to move forward without letting past pain define the future. By the end of the talk, they weren't magically best friends, but there was a spark of understanding that hadn't been there before. And that small step toward healing felt monumental in a family that had been fractured for far too long. Back at the office, rumors continued to swirl, but Mirabelle had bigger issues to tackle, like regaining the board's trust and ensuring crucial projects stayed on track. She was reviewing some finance reports in her new, albeit temporary, CEO office when Desmond knocked on the open door. He stepped in cautiously, his usual warm smile dimmed by an air of seriousness. They exchanged pleasantries, but Mirabelle felt something was off. Finally, Desmond exhaled and admitted he'd been hiding something. Her heart pounded as she recalled the phone call she'd overheard. In halting words, he explained that he was actually the heir to a major business empire, one that had ties in multiple industries. His father had sent him here incognito to learn the ropes at the ground level instead of just being handed the top position one day. Mirabelle's eyes widened, and for a split second, she felt a sense of validation. Her suspicions had been on the mark. But soon after, a whirlwind of other feelings took over. She felt slightly betrayed that he hadn't told her earlier, but also understood why he'd kept it quiet. Desmond spoke with sincerity, explaining he'd grown tired of being treated like a privileged golden boy. He wanted to earn respect based on his work ethic, not his last name. Then he paused, looking directly into Mirabelle's eyes. He admitted that one of the reasons he'd been drawn to her was because she also seemed to be navigating a world where she didn't entirely fit in. He admired her authenticity, her quiet diligence, and the soft kindness that peeked through her reserved nature. Hearing him say that left Mirabelle feeling vulnerable yet strangely reassured. Here was someone who truly saw her not as a shy wallflower or a stepping stone, but as a person worth knowing. After Desmond's confession, the tension that had been hanging between them started to melt. They talked openly about their lives, her father's illness, her unexpected promotion, and his undercover quest for real-world experience. Mirabelle asked how it felt to juggle an identity so different from what everyone believed, and Desmond shrugged, saying it was both liberating and exhausting. He didn't have to be the polished heir all the time, but he also missed the comfort of simply being honest about who he was. Their conversation turned to the challenges Mirabelle faced as the acting CEO. She confessed how terrifying it felt to be center stage, with board members second-guessing her every decision. She worried that one misstep could ruin everything her father had built. Desmond listened intently, nodding in understanding. Then he reminded her that strength doesn't always come from speaking loudly, sometimes it's found in quiet persistence. He also mentioned how people at the office were starting to notice changes under her leadership, like more collaborative meetings and a warmer office culture. She looked surprised. "They are?" she asked, and he smiled, saying he'd heard employees talk about how she gave thoughtful feedback and seemed genuinely interested in their ideas. Mirabelle felt a flutter of pride, mixed with disbelief. Before leaving her office, Desmond gently placed a hand on her shoulder, offering reassurance. "Don't underestimate the power of simply caring," he said. "Your quiet style might be exactly what this place needs. People here are used to brash, top-down management. You're bringing something fresh, empathy." His words wrapped around her like a soft blanket of support. In that moment, Mirabelle realized they were both forging their paths in a landscape shaped by other people's expectations. Together, they could lean on each other's strengths and maybe, just maybe, help each other break free of old fears. With Desmond's moral support and the memory of her father's trust fueling her resolve, Mirabelle threw herself into revitalizing the company. She noticed that employees had long been discouraged from sharing ideas or voicing concerns, so she started hosting open forums where anyone could speak up. The first few sessions were rocky, people were skeptical, unsure if it was genuinely safe to air out grievances. But slowly, as word spread that Mirabelle actually listened, the turnout grew. She also implemented small but meaningful changes, like flexible hours for parents juggling daycare schedules and a more straightforward system for internal promotions. Some board members grumbled that she was focusing too much on soft policies, but Mirabelle believed a happy workforce led to better productivity. She had data to back up her stance, and whenever someone questioned her decisions, she quietly presented the facts, letting the numbers speak for themselves. Little by little, the corporate culture began to shift. The hallways felt less tense and department meetings became more collaborative. Even Ms. Dawson, who'd been a major skeptic, began showing grudging respect when she saw projects get completed more smoothly under Mirabelle's new approach. And though rumors about her inexperience still lingered, the rising morale in the office was hard to deny. Mirabelle also tapped Desmond to lead a small project that merged finance and marketing efforts, an area he had some expertise in despite his secret background. She let him prove himself on his own terms without revealing his true identity. It was another step toward creating a climate where people were judged by their contributions, not their titles or connections. Every day was still a challenge, of course. Mirabelle had her moments of doubt, times when she'd stumble over her words in a meeting or feel her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. But now she had the hope that change was actually possible, and that made all the difference. As the weeks went by, Mirabelle continued to shake up the old ways. She streamlined bloated processes, cutting through layers of bureaucracy that had long frustrated even the most patient employees. Some seasoned department heads balked at this, questioning how a young, soft-spoken CEO could possibly know better. Yet Mirabelle presented a calm, fact-based argument each time. She didn't win every battle, but she won enough to make a dent. Her biggest challenge came during a crucial budget meeting. She proposed reallocating funds from a flashy but less essential PR campaign to boost in-house training and professional development programs. A couple of board members were furious. They felt the PR campaign was crucial for maintaining the company's public image. Mirabelle countered that investing in employee growth could lead to innovation and better retention, which, in the long run, would speak louder than any short-lived media blitz. The debate grew heated. At one point, a particularly stubborn board member sneered, "We can't have a timid child dictating the company's financial decisions." Mirabelle felt her cheeks burn, but she refused to back down. She calmly reiterated the plan, detailing how supporting employees would, in turn, bolster the company's reputation more authentically. By the end of the meeting, most of the board had come around, albeit grudgingly. Word of her unwavering stance spread throughout the company and even to a few industry contacts on the outside. Employees began to see her not as a mere placeholder, but as someone willing to fight for positive change. The shift was subtle at first, but soon enough, her office phone was buzzing with managers who actually wanted her opinion. She didn't magically become some extroverted powerhouse. She was still Mirabelle, quiet, introspective, and sometimes nervous. But she was learning that you could be reserved and still command respect if your actions spoke louder than your volume. Mirabelle's steady progress led to an invitation to speak at a major corporate event, a panel discussion on leadership and innovation. First, she was petrified. The idea of standing in front of a large crowd, microphones pointed her way, reporters taking notes, sent her heart racing. But she knew the company needed positive exposure, especially now that it was under such close scrutiny. After much deliberation, and with gentle encouragement from Desmond, she agreed to do it. On the day of the event, she stood backstage feeling like she could barely breathe. She remembered how Chloe used to tease her about freezing in front of people. But then she thought of her father. He would be proud to see her step out of her comfort zone. Drawing a deep breath, she stepped onto the stage. The lights were glaring, the audience a sea of blurred faces. Her voice wobbled a bit at first, but she clung to the prepared notes in her mind. She spoke about the importance of nurturing employees, how a company's real strength lies in collective well-being, not just profit margins. She used real examples from her brief but impactful tenure, like the open forums and the improved training programs. Each story illustrated how thoughtful leadership could boost morale and lead to tangible results. Partway through, the nervousness began to ebb, replaced by a sense of purpose. People in the audience leaned forward, listening intently. One journalist even asked a question about how she balanced being naturally reserved with leading a large organization. Mirabelle smiled, admitting she was still learning, but found that empathy and careful listening could be just as powerful as bold speeches. When she wrapped up, the applause was genuine, even enthusiastic. The event organizers congratulated her backstage, mentioning how her fresh perspective resonated with many attendees. Walking away, she felt lighter, like she'd just taken one giant step closer to owning her identity on her own terms. News of Mirabelle's successful talk circulated quickly. It reached her family, her father's hospital room, and even parts of the social circles Chloe frequented. Her mother called her one evening with a voice tinged in both pride and regret. "I saw the live stream of your panel," she said softly. "You were amazing, Belle." Mirabelle felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected compliment. A few days later, while Mirabelle was visiting her father, her mother and Chloe showed up unannounced. Chloe, looking uncharacteristically nervous, handed Mirabelle a small bouquet of flowers. "I got these for Dad," she explained, but her gaze lingered on Mirabelle. An unspoken apology seemed to hover between them. They found a quiet corner in the hospital lounge to talk. Her mother opened by admitting that she was wrong to dismiss Mirabelle's reserved nature as a flaw. Chloe, fiddling with the hem of her shirt, confessed she'd always been jealous of how much attention Mirabelle got from their dad, even though she never asked for it. She admitted that her jabs and teasing were a misguided way to stand out. Mirabelle listened, her eyes brimming with tears. She felt a wave of emotions, relief, sadness, and a budding sense of forgiveness. Their father, still recovering but more alert now, called them closer to his bedside. He looked at each of them, tears in his own eyes, and said he'd never been prouder. He thanked Mirabelle for stepping up, thanked Chloe for being there, and their mother for staying strong. In that moment, something shifted in the family dynamic. Apologies were given, grudges released. It wasn't a perfect fairy tale reconciliation, there was still a lot of healing needed. But they'd taken the first real step, acknowledging each other's pain and deciding, consciously, to move forward. That night, Mirabelle felt the familial love she'd once thought she'd lost for good. With her family slowly mending and the company on a positive trajectory, Mirabelle stood on the cusp of a new chapter. Her father's health improved day by day, and the doctors hinted he might be able to return to light work soon. Yet, something in Mirabelle had changed forever. She wasn't the same silent observer she'd been before. Now she understood that her voice had value and that sometimes standing in the spotlight was necessary not for self-glory but to lead others with integrity and compassion. During one final meeting as acting CEO, Mirabelle announced a new set of initiatives aimed at ongoing employee development and mental health support. She cited how crucial it was to create an environment where everyone felt seen and heard. The board watched, some faces still tinged with disbelief, but many now wore expressions of respect. Her calm authority left its mark. After the meeting, Desmond pulled her aside. He decided to reveal his true identity to his immediate supervisor and a few key colleagues, planning to wrap up his undercover stint. He thanked Mirabelle for showing him that leadership doesn't have to be loud or brash to be effective. They shared a moment of mutual understanding, two people who'd navigated expectations they never asked for and came out stronger for it. Eventually, the day came when her father was well enough to resume his duties. Mirabelle handed back the reins with a gentle smile, knowing she'd done right by him and by herself. She wouldn't vanish into obscurity again, though. People at the office now knew who she was and what she stood for. She left an indelible impression. A quiet leader who steered the ship with empathy and resolve. Standing on the hospital steps with her family, Mirabelle felt an unfamiliar sense of belonging. She looked ahead, seeing not the shy, invisible girl but a confident woman who had proven that even the most reserved soul can shine when it's guided by love, purpose, and unbreakable resilience.